Hey,
Hi,
Anna.
Kevin. How are you doing? Haven't seen
Um,
you for ages.
yeah, I'm all right. It's been a crazy year. I've been kind of not able to to do a whole lot of extracurricular stuff. How are you?
I'm fine. I was teaching in the last semester. Now I'm preparing for a research in the Circle School.
Oh, nice. Good.
Yeah, I'm
Nice.
going to study a children's self-organization and politics in their play.
Oh, okay. Nice.
Yeah.
To see if like the democratic free school
Well,
nature
the
like has
claim
any.
is that when children play, they create egalitarian relationships. They lead, it's a lived democracy. There are several research articles like that. And I think it's
Right.
much more complex. And also,
I
most of the
suspect so.
studies are done in very highly supervised daycares or
Right.
first grades where the children cannot have any chance for self-organization, you know.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, as a parent of two young kids, and I've been around, a whole bunch of other kids they're playing with. Like, I mean, it seems like adults have to intervene a lot precisely because when it's left to kids' own device, like a hierarchy often does kind of emerge.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, not
Yeah.
always. I
Yeah.
think that it's that it's a practice like any other. Many things could emerge.
Mhm.
And I want to study really first what is there. And I think TCS allows, because of no supervision or very small amount of
Yeah.
supervision, it's almost like a free play of children like me who played outside of the house and with no supervision for
Right.
ages, played the
Right.
whole day outside in our groups. There nobody
Yeah.
saw us, you know.
Yeah. I mean, it would be an interesting question in of itself is when kids play without a certain level of supervision over time,
Right,
does the nature of how they play evolve? Like if they know that no one is going to step in, does
right.
it actually change over time? Does it become more egalitarian? Does it become less egalitarian?
Either that or there is a dose of taking responsibility for the other when you know that it's no one else's responsibility but yours.
Mhm. Yeah.
For,
Yeah.
for
Very true.
self and another, you know.
Yeah. Very true. That'll be an interesting study. How long are you gonna be looking at it in the circle
Well,
school?
it's also I'm trying to create it together with the teens there because they're interested teens to be researchers.
Oh, okay.
So it will depend on how we shape the whole study because it's just going to start. And I don't know all the decisions because I left it open for us to work together.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well,
So it will be an adventure in two ways. But I was planning for about a semester, maybe longer.
yeah.
Hi, Eugene.
Hey, Eugene.
Hi, how are you doing? Wow, Kevin, I didn't see you for maybe a whole year. I didn't see you.
Yeah, it was about a year. It was about a year.
Yeah.
It's about a year. I took
Wow.
an
Well,
adventure-filled
just
hiatus.
there is something wrong with my Zoom. Boom.
What's wrong? It just zooms into you.
Um, just a sec. There is uh, uh can I change on the Zoom how I the view? It's on here.
Hi,
Okay.
Mark.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, now
Fine.
it's
How
good.
are you doing?
Good.
Perfect. Hi,
Good to
Mark.
see
Mark,
you.
did you see
Hello.
my messages that I sent you
Hold on.
via website, DPJ website? I'm sorry, guys. It's just like
Oh no, I didn't. I'll look at that.
ah.
Thanks.
So
I'm
you're
not
not
getting
getting
notified for some reason about it. I'll check.
yeah, because I really like that you send that message to me and I replied to you, and then another one, and you usually replying. I know that, and that's why I kind of get a little bit of
Oh,
concerned
you
that
sent it
you're not getting that.
yesterday. I see it now. Okay.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry, I didn't notice that.
Can you, okay, well, we'll talk about that. Kind of
Sure.
figure out like why you're not getting the notification. That's
Mhm.
that.
I am getting them. I didn't see it. Sorry.
Uh-huh. No,
Okay.
that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah, good.
So Kevin, just a minute. I was talking a little bit about my own, but what are you doing? Why was it so busy your semester?
Oh, nothing like academic related. It was all on a personal level.
Oh,
It's my personal life ended up suddenly in shambles, I guess.
mm,
So I've been rebuilding
Yes.
that.
okay.
Sorry, yeah, I saw that. Well, sorry, not sorry. Difficult to say. It's probably
It's
both.
always, yeah, it's there's a lot more to that story that I don't generally share publicly that made it really a year of just
Mm.
it's been a doozy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry to hear that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
I just on completely different things. I discovered a new option for uh, for PC for Windows that actually you can actually see and make messages on through your Windows to iPhone, and you can read them through that. That's for a
That's
long
handy.
time. It was a big problem. Anyway, it's called Unison, Intel Unison.
God,
Ah.
Mr. Bob Jubel's in the group.
Yeah, so
Hi, Bob.
finally you can
Hello
do it. Hi,
there,
Bob.
Kevin. Good to see you.
It's good to see you too, Bob.
Yeah,
Wasn't expecting you to pop in. Awesome.
yep,
It is a history discussion, so
it sure is. Absolutely.
Okay. So should we start? It's 11:04.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start and let's start. I guess we all know each other, but maybe with one sentence about what's the newest thing in your life. So Eugene.
Okay, well, I'm Eugene. What's new? My sabbatical is coming. In a few days, my sabbatical will start, which is, I know that probably other people will hate me except Bob and Anna, but for that, but I just want to say, and I just finished working on a paper about Tolstoy. It's actually also historical. Lev Tolstoy about his. I'm considering him now as the first um, democratic educator who conceptualized about that and actually created interesting practice in the middle of 19th century. And actually, I found that it's not only me who thinks like that. There is quite a few others. But I think this is a more like in this article, I'm analyzing his pedagogy and his
Mhm.
educational approach and so on and so forth, and his struggles.
Thank you, Eugene. Bob.
Yes, Bob Hampel. What's new? Well, I'm teaching in our Academy for Lifelong Learning. And about a month ago, I told the director that we need to do more to encourage student participation rather than just listening to lectures or watching PowerPoints. So she drafted me to help lead the charge. So this is going to be an interesting adventure to see whether or not I can convince volunteers to think about changing or expanding their instructional repertoire. So I'll keep you posted on what happens this spring.
Oh,
nice.
very interesting. Okay. Thank you. And next to me is Mark.
Yeah, hello everyone. Nice to see you guys. I live in New York City, and work at a university out in Jersey. So I've been doing a lot of work now with Hispanic undergraduates, trying to explore why they have decided to attend college and what excites them about it, so on. So that research is ongoing, and I'm kind of excited about pursuing that. I'm thinking about next year even expanding that into graduates, people who have just recently graduated, and also people who are school leavers. So that should be interesting.
Mm-hmm. And Kevin, anything new professionally?
Oh, let's see. Yeah. Well, so for those who don't know me, I'm a teaching full professor now at East Carolina University. So I guess the first thing is I was promoted to a full teaching professor. Let's see. So I haven't been writing a whole lot because this past year has been really crazy. So I haven't really written a whole lot. Although I do have a popular article that's been accepted by Philosophy Now magazine, which is like a general philosophy magazine. Let's see. So professionally, I am still shopping a book that I have completed editing on, like kind of the works of, I hate to say the word canonical anarchists in the same phrase, but like the kind of the, the mainstay anarchist writers on education. So, Eugene mentioned Tolstoy. There's Kropotkin's written, Goldman's written, obviously William Godwin wrote. But the problem is they're all essays that are all available in separate collections. So I organized them by theme. And I'm still shopping that. It's proving to be a challenge because no publishers are very interested in stuff that's already open access. Because technically all the works except for my introduction are open access. And one of the criteria I have for publishing it is I would really like it to be not only at an affordable price, but there'd be some edition that is actually free of charge because technically all of these articles that I've accumulated are, again, open access. And that is making it a huge challenge to find a publisher. So worst comes to worst, I'll self-publish the thing, but I'd really like to get a publisher for it. And I guess the last thing is what drew me to this discussion about this book is I'm using this book in an ongoing article, trying to argue both through philosophical analysis and historical analysis that I think if you look at the pedagogical ideas of self-directed and democratic learning by people like John Holt, Dan Greenberg, you find a certain semi-sophisticated form of relativism in there. And I think there's historical reasons why that would be the case. And I think there are philosophical reasons to show that they are in fact fairly relativistic thinkers. So
Interesting. Thank you so much. And for me, the new thing that is coming is research that I'm planning in the Circle School with with all the children there, all the students, but the teen students will be part of my research team with whom I will finalize the research, and we will be looking at children's play, self-organization, and political moves in conditions of very minimal supervision of the adults. So that's my interest. Maybe their interest will be also something else. So that's very big adventure, and I'm very much looking forward. All right, so here we are to discuss Miller's book, and our standard question is who in this book club just to find out where people's perspectives are, who is a good student and who is becoming a good student, defining a good student as somebody who read the book and becoming a good student who on various stages of knowledge about the book, from just knowing the title to read something and things like that. So how about you? Are you, what kind of a student are you in our book club?
I'm a pretty good student. I've read most of this book, although some of it was around a year ago, and there are other chapters that if I read them, I actually don't remember having read them.
Okay, but good student. Okay, what about you, Mark? I'm going the opposite there.
Yeah, I'm a fairly good student here. I read most of the book, although I skimmed a lot of paragraphs, to be honest. That sort of got a little bit more and tried to focus a lot on the main ideas.
Okay, and Bob,
Good student, good student.
you read?
I
Of
read
course
it
you
all.
are. Of course you are.
Yep, yep.
I don't think we even need to ask Eugene, but
Yeah,
Eugene,
if I'm here, I've read it.
You should ask Eugene because Eugene is excellent student. I've read it twice.
Right.
First time
Wow.
is about 2 years ago, and I've read second time, and absolutely my impression is very different from first time to the second time.
oh, very interesting.
Partially because my work on Tolstoy, so it was very helpful. But partially probably I changed between these 2 years, that probably as well. And
Mhm. Okay, similar for me. I'm both a good student and partially good student. I read it also twice, once a few years ago, and now I've read everything except one chapter in the middle about Holt that I intentionally left out to study separately. But similar to Eugene, I so much changed in the way how I was reading this book that it's incredible to myself. All right. So let's start with your general impression. Like, well, what's your general opinion, and then we can open up particular issues. Whoever wants.
Well, I can start if,
Okay.
by the way, Anna, I think it should be a good idea in systematic way to everybody to ask, because by doing that, we
Mhm.
might, some people might skip that. So,
Right. Okay.
um,
So let's start this way. Eugene, then Bob, then Mark, then
yeah,
Annie. Okay.
at least this time, and then it will be free thing. So, for me, well, first of all, first time I didn't like the book. Second time I really liked the book. So, at the same time, it's not like I'm changed 180 degrees. I just more appreciate and more understood him. So what I like about the book is I think it's a very good uh, scholarship, both historical and philosophical and analytical, in my view, of the free school movement. Again, some people might disagree because you might know more about that than me. But from what I know and from what I know up to now, I think it's a very both good analysis and critique of that. And I really like that he provided critique from different directions. I realized that I don't like free school movement, and it's helped me to. This is what I knew uh, from my first reading, and but I would say the second type of reading helped me really figure out like why I don't like it, and I strongly don't like it. I think it's for me it's. First of all, for me, it's another form of progressive education. And I understand that there is a difference between classical progressive educators, more like Dewey, and this type of progressive education, because this is more like a hybrid progressive education and democratic education. But still, it's hugely there is a huge progressivism there. But I really like now Ron Miller because for the work he's done. Again, somebody can prove that I'm wrong, but I feel that critical analysis that he made, I think it's very helpful for both understanding what free schooling was about historically, philosophically, ideologically, politically, and also critique of that from different flanks. This is what I really like. Also, what I like about that, he really was good on indicating diversity within free schooling. And I like that both in terms of the practice and in terms of the theoretical justification of that and tensions within that movement as well. On that, I will stop. Thank
Mhm.
you.
Okay, thank you. Bob?
Okay. I liked how he gave very good snapshots of several dozen of the major authors. Sometimes they were longer, especially for John Holt. Sometimes they were shorter, but it brought back memories of having read those authors many years ago. I thought he was even-handed in the way he summarized the different points of view. So in that sense, it's a good survey. It's not quite as strong in terms of primary sources, although he did make use of the materials at Yale, which has an incredible collection of newsletters and pamphlets from free schools. I also thought he did a good job in separating free schools from other forms of alternative education in the late 60s and 70s, because it's easy to lump them all together. And I know myself, I've often done that when I think about the late 60s and early 70s. I think, well, there was more variety. There were more choices. And that's how I've always made sense of that period. But as Eugene just mentioned, he does a nice job in telling us about the differences among and within the different free schools. I do wish he talked more about how many free schools were private as opposed to public, because he oftentimes suggests that this is a pulling away from public schools. But as I recall, a number of public school systems did have the free schools or the equivalent of free schools. So I think that would have been helpful to just pin down whether these were primarily private or whether they were more public. So those were some of the key things that struck me as I read this. All in all, I thought it was a solid book.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Mark. Mhm.
Yeah, I was very intrigued by the themes that came out of this book, particularly notions of personal authenticity, human potential movement, the anti-technocratic, kind of approach or views of many of the kind of the founders of the free school movement, and the tensions that he discusses with democracy, and also just these desires people had for community, as could be described, authenticity and community. I would have loved to have seen, as Bob pointed out, but I don't know to what extent that material is even available, given the fact that it's the primary sources and the just a little. I would love to have seen more discussion of the challenges that these schools experienced in trying to run themselves. That the chapter towards the end describes that and describes those tensions really well. And I feel like I get an overview, but I would have loved to have seen more of the messy details. But but in general, very interesting, thought-provoking book.
Thank you, Mark. Kevin. Hi, Teresa.
Yep. Let's see. Okay, yeah, so I'm unmuted. Good. Actually, Mark, just to piggyback on that, if you want some books that are more kind of like the details of the experience of some of these schools, is it Paul Avrich wrote a book on the free schools in New York City, I think it was. I'm blanking on the title. There's a few different books that I could cite for you that are like kind of blow by blows, either historical accounts or like biographical accounts. I think the Albany Free School, I think the founder of that had a book about that it was kind of like a blow by blow of like, here's what went right, here's what went wrong, stuff like that. So the only way I can give you my impressions of this book is if you sort of understand the history and the mindset that led me into this book, because I was looking at it with a particular purpose. So I have had kind of a luxury and the weird experience of seeing self-directed learning as a movement from the inside and then seeing it from the outside afterwards. I guess a few years ago now, I had been pretty embedded in the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. And then for reasons I won't get into, I wasn't so much, and I was kind of on the outside. So that allowed me to kind of think about self-directed learning and democratic education as a movement that may be more historically contingent than a lot of the people inside the movement often realize or talk of it as. They talk of it as a sort of thing that's, I don't want to say inevitable, but the more natural way to do like learning. But it's really a very liberal Western way of doing learning that's contingent on a lot of factors that I think intersected in the 60s and 70s. So when I was thinking about that, it led me to this book. There's two different histories of the movement. there's this book and there's one I think that's called like Free the Children or something like that. It's on my shelf back there. And I read those two books. So I was really interested in the early chapter, the early, I think like two chapters that really talked about like the historical correlates or the historical predecessors that led to this movement. So for instance, I mean, Eugene mentioned Tolstoy as like one of the first kind of the first democratic educator advocate for. I would challenge that actually and say William Godwin when I think of it, but you could say Tolstoy. But Tolstoy didn't have the vocabulary that modern folks do, like John Holt and Dan Greenberg. So when I was in these circles, I was hearing words like authenticity, authentic learning, kind of like being your true self. This learning inspires you to be your true self. And as a historian, it always bothered me because everyone talked about those as like these obvious categories that everyone should be able to make sense of. But those really came through the human potential movement. I mean, like the talk of a true self and like you grow into your true self is like contingent on Maslow, is contingent on Carl Rogers. So I was just really interested in those chapters and kind of looking at this as a very historically contingent movement where if these certain things didn't intersect culturally, like the anti-authoritarianism, the concern with big bureaucracy, the human potential movement at the same exact time, that you may not have had any sort of widespread movement at all. Now, I don't think that's the argument that this book makes, but that's the argument that I sort of came into this book thinking about. And I think this book kind of helped convince me that that's probably right.
We cannot hear.
Thank you, Kevin. Sorry, I muted my coughing. Thank you so much. And hi, Teresa. We are just starting with our general opinions. And so do you have a general opinion that you could share about this book?
I'm sorry, I've been a little bit ill, so I have been resting and not been able to get to the book, but I am what Eugene used to say, I am a good learner.
Okay, that's wonderful. So it's up to you then to ask very good questions for all of us who seem to have read the book. Great. So here is my general opinion, similar and with many questions. So first of all, I really, really liked reading this book, and I think it comes the change in me because I read it before and I thought of it. I don't know. I was not impressed first time to say like this, and I thought, oh, when we chose it, oh, again this book, I don't know. But then I just started the rediscovering many things here. And I think that the change for me came from the studying and for the last 4 or 5 years that school in Norway and the whole study that I made that was published last year in our journal of that the first democratic school in Norway that was founded by students where that's one thing. And another thing is, I guess, working more closely with Jim Rietmulder for that study and for an interview. And in general, these last 5 years completely, I think, changed the way I'm looking at it. I did not know so much about free schools and their difference from democratic schools. And that started to clear up for me even before this book. But this book really clinched it for me a lot to think about like what exactly is the difference. Second thing that I really didn't know and or didn't pay attention first time was the political background. I knew it was 60s and everything, but I wrote a little bit and studied a little bit about it also for the study of the democratic school in Oslo that also was founded in 1967. So it's the same period when these kind of movements mushroom in a way. But some things that that was here that Miller brought really took my attention about this politicization of education or not, the dilemma whether it should be political by its goal or it is political anyway because it's a different and alternative approach. So that was very interesting to read too. Then in context to that, I was thinking about another project that I'm still working on in the background, and that's the project of let's say bringing the work of my mother, who was in Yugoslavia, a founder of the preschool education, very much inspired, I would say, by the New Left, Marcuse, and that approach through a whole group of philosophers in Yugoslavia and in the wider that were humanist Marxists and trying to, just like Marcuse and Adorno, trying to revamp that kind of thing. And her struggles to redefine preschool education in terms of not completely progressive, although that was still prevailing, but there was she never finished her work. That's the other thing. She died very young. So anyway, all of these things somehow through this book came into play for me. And another fourth thing, I was a part of the Project Learn School in Philadelphia, which was one of the started as one of the public free schools or alternative schools, and he writes a little bit about the mayor here, or education superintendent, and then had to change and become private when that movement was taken off from the public schools. And knowing it also, like Kevin did, a little bit from inside as a parent, not as a teacher, and then from the outside, kind of, there was a lot of things that resonated for me to discuss in this book. So this is, in short, what for me was a new rediscovery of themes and tensions that existed from the very beginning of this movement. Okay, so here now we are free to move into whatever direction we want to, and start to discuss particular topics that are very interesting.
Can I ask a question now?
Yes.
Kevin mentioned the discourses of true self and authenticity that are part of discourses that precede this text, perhaps. And I was wondering that these discourses have been cornerstone to many multicultural movements around education, both critical and uncritical. And I'm wondering whether or not the true self is a concept of Western ideas of trying to find a singular self and not understanding not understanding other notions of self that are ephemeral, contingent, and constantly in flux.
And I can actually, I think you're right. And there's a story that I can tell that illustrates. I was at a regional meetup of Agile Learning Centers when I was the president of the Pathfinder School in Durham, North Carolina. And we were in some meeting where we were trying to brainstorm words we would use to explain what our schools do to like prospective, customers. And one of the words that people came up with was individuality or individualism. It was something like that. And like they got a lot of boos because like that's too Western. It's too Western. The very next word they came up with was authentic. And everyone was like thumbs up. And I'm like, as a historian, I am like biting my tongue because I'm like, I don't think you all realize how Western that idea is. But I was in that situation a lot, where I was one of the few people who was kind of trying to question that idea of like authenticity. Because I mean, if you look at like, I've looked at a lot of Buddhist and Taoist texts, I've been studying them for years, and there is no notion of authenticity at all, because not because they think that you're inauthentic. The binary doesn't make sense because everything is social. So how could you talk about authentic and a social if everything is socially interwoven? But anyway, yeah, that's
Can I jump on that? I think one thing that I feel free school movement extremely oppressive, in my view, because of this normativity. It doesn't matter, by the way, what normativity. Somebody dislike individualistic. So what's wrong with individualistic? Some people like to be individualistic. At the same time, some it has to be authentic. What if I don't want to be authentic for certain things? And there are so many things. This very oppressive way of thinking, and they're fighting with each other about that, by the way, which is I find also oppressive. Because for me, why it's oppressive? Because it's monopolistic notion of education that it should be imposed on everybody else. It's true that some the particular forms that they personally like, I think they should. There is nothing wrong with that. I don't feel nothing wrong. If you want to be communal, fine. But there are some people don't want to be communal, and it should be also fine. And some should be societal, some should be individual. There is 100 million zillions possibilities, but they immediately impose on that. And again, I was working about this work on Tolstoy, and Tolstoy also had this vision, but with one huge exception that they didn't have. That's why Tolstoy's democratic educators, in my view, they're at best hybrids, but not democratic, because Tolstoy was like that, that he really thought that any student can overrule him, and they did with all his very much almost disgust. But, and I can give you examples with Tolstoy, how he allows overruling and he accepts overruling because he saw that life is much more richer than his dear ideas. And they didn't have that sense. They're very oppressive in the sense that they continue imposing their ideological chores on everybody else and on each other, by the way. And this is what I find very oppressive in this movement, free school movement. It's not very free in that sense.
so
Right.
one of the interesting things is when I was doing a lot of digging about like the historical corollaries of the democratic school movement and free schools and unschooling. I read a history of the Esalen Institute in California, which was kind of like the hotbed of the what was it, the human potential movement and stuff like that. And to Eugene's point, um, there were several parts of the history where it's like this thing almost turned into a little cult, which is odd because it's so focused on human potential and everyone going on their own path. But once you have this idea that there's a true self and the true self is spontaneous and the true self is emotionally open and like whatever, they had this very normative idea of how we would know if you were your true self. So what would happen is people would start like kind of competing to see how true of a self they could be relative to other people. So it became really oppressive. And like Fritz Perls was a psychologist who was basically like a dictator at that place. And he would basically be able to say, like, this person is being their true self, and you're not being your true self. And how do I know? Because you're not behaving the way a true self would behave. And so like the whole thing just became this like exercise in irony. And I think that, yeah, I think some of that probably is in evidence and was in evidence at some of the democratic schools, I have to imagine.
Right. What I find all of this part of this monism in a way, like Kantian monism in a way, because there is one set of true values, truth of what exists, and whoever does not see that is either irrational or not good intended or something like that. And that's been in education even with most, I think, theoreticians and practitioners, that there is one best way, even when they say we don't want best practices, but there is one true way instead of pluralism. And again, in this democratic school in Oslo, where the students discuss that, one thing about pluralism is that it comes out as weak or relativistic.
Mm, mm,
because it cannot be radical
Mm.
in itself. It's a radicalism for any one idea becomes antithesis. So it's very hard to kind of like argue in that way. To many, I don't think that it's in general very hard, but in many instances, it becomes like, well, why can't everybody do as they want? Then it's like it doesn't have kind of like one strong push. I think it's in its nature. Mhm.
Do you think, this is a question to everyone, do you think that normativity is a group process so that insiders versus outsiders in relationship to the thinking is a natural or is an inevitable uh, uh, norm setting um, kind of activity in forming communities?
My answer to that, it's for when I see pluralism, I see dualism, and it's very important dualism. There is a very fashionable to fight dualisms, and I think it's a very bad idea. By the way, it's also dualistic idea to fight dualisms because everything's divided by dualistic and non-dualistic. I'm for this pragmatic. Sometimes dualism is good, sometimes it's not good, like
Mm.
everything else in life. But in this dualism, it's visionary and pluralistic should be. So it's okay to be visionary. There's nothing wrong about that. As but at the same time, you have to be also pluralistic. Pluralistic, like in that statement about freedom of speech. I might disagree with you, but I support your efforts, and so on and so forth. And I think that having this tension with dualistic tension, I think extremely helpful. So there is nothing wrong to create communal, for example, things. There is nothing wrong to create non-communal. By the way, there is nothing wrong to have technological education as well. Ah, wow. So the problem with technological education, it's a monopoly on everything. And this is what they didn't realize. There is nothing wrong with this drills, whatever, if it's not monopolistic. If some people, and for some moments and whatever, they like to have this type of education, there is nothing wrong about that. Uh,
Also,
you may
yeah.
you may be personally very much disgusted by that. Okay, don't do it, don't practice it, move away from that. But don't try to destroy that just because you find it very oppressive for yourself. And just okay, move away, create your own and fine, and don't claim that this is what you created is the best, and it must be everything should be smacked just because it's really works well for you in some people of yours. That's
I would say that there are certain areas of learning and education that must be drill, like learning to play instruments or sing or whatever. A lot of art needs that kind of a skill that is based on something becoming organically in your body, which you only can get if you do it many times. But some
But
people,
Anna, would you say that people who already have that already hardwired into their body need to drill that?
I don't know. That's what it's not for me to decide. It's for the person to decide who needs it or not need it, whether they want it or not. And so I don't think that I should prescribe to anybody whether they must do it or not do it or never do it.
Mm.
I mean, I'm really curious and interested. Again, it was a while ago since I read the book, so I don't remember a whole lot of the chapter, but chapter 2 is specifically called Free School Ideology. I really like that title because, again, in my experience, people within the free school movement did not ever really think that theirs was an ideology. It was just sort of like, we're just free of it. Like, we're the one group who's like free of ideology because we don't impose things on students. But I was always a little suspicious of that. First of all, because the free school movement struck me as very politically homogenous, and I don't think that was an accident. But secondly, because while you're not imposing something on people, you are saying if you want to be here, here are the ground rules.
Mm.
And if you, so it's like by select, it's like a selection effect. Like you're not imposing things on people, but the only people who stay are the people who abide by those rules. So like the idea that the individual learner is sort of on his or her own in terms of the responsibility to move their own education. I think
do you
that's part of an ideology. I think that's part of like a very Western liberalism.
Mm.
It doesn't make sense in other contexts. Like if you had like a deeply conservative religious community, they wouldn't be able to make sense of that idea. It's foreign to them. They wouldn't have the vocabulary even to grasp that. There's nothing wrong with it being part of an ideology, but I guess when you admit that it's an ideology, you do have to be a little bit humble in a way that I think that a lot of folks didn't want to be. Very humble. You have to admit that ours is one ideology among many.
What do you think of that critique that moving away from public education is fragmenting and ruining possibility for actually having a public forum, education as a public forum where ideas meet, and moving away is in your own little enclave is in a way not changing the whole education for the better.
Well, at one point in the book, he addresses that in I thought a memorable way. He said in the 1960s, many free schoolers wanted to change the world. By the 1970s, many parents in particular said, I want to protect my child. I don't care about transforming the world. I want to protect my child. And it could be literally protect from physical danger in a tough urban district, or it could be protect in the sense of piling up the grades to get into a good college. But I think he does make a case for this turn in the 70s and 80s toward private gains from education and much less concern for the public good, which of course is a major theme in the work of David Lavery, who many of us have read.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he talks about that tension in those. I like that one segment. I think it was on page oh gosh, I have the page number in front of me when I'm holding a cup of coffee in my hand. Page 128, where he sort of talks about the very, I think it's 128, that very like parent meetings where parents are coming and saying these things, and these educators find themselves. He doesn't say it, but I get the feeling like my intuition's just running through my mind. I can just imagine the hostility that so many of those preschool educators had towards parents that were coming with that exact ideas in the 70s, saying, I want my child to, flourish or whatever. And the response on their part is, but what about our organic community or something like this, and it's just sort of like they're clearly at odds with the desires of many parents at that time to, as you nicely put it, to protect their children, and at the same time not aware of the philosophy and the as Eugene put it, the almost like the how to put it, the single-minded like ideology that they espoused that was highly normative. It just very strange to me that I mean, it's not surprising, but at the same time, and another thing that's kind of interesting for me, and Kevin made me think of this, it's almost like free school education needed a cult leader to sort of solidify itself. It didn't have it.
I found a very interesting discussion at the end of the book with reference to, I think, if correctly remember, name Aaron, who
Yes.
looks like was a legal scholar who studied education from legal point of view, who found that public education, specifically focus on public education, does not have any dialogues. It's mostly fights for monopoly, for who how to impose their views on and force the state as a as a really source of the power and violence to impose that on everybody else. And there is a fight for this weapon, basically, and to hit each other. And there is not much discussions going on there in education. So all this idea of the public discussion in public school is very overrated. There is no evidence much for that. At least from legal point of view, that he found, and I think it's a very interesting thing. Another part, what I like this book about, and it's a very enlightenment project, and I can hear even in our discussion about that because the education is used as a tool for making society better, and for parents making society better, it's could be social mobility, upward social mobility for their children. So for somebody else, it could be this communal communal life. For somebody else, it can be social justice and so on and so forth. The question, of course, what's about intrinsic focus on education as a practice in itself rather than serving to somebody else, which is not enlightenment question, because for enlightenment, how this was starting with Kant, for him enlightenment is using education as a force for making society better. This, which very interesting, it's instrumental approach to the education, which themselves they criticize, but not from that side.
Yeah.
That side has always remained a blind spot for them because they remain, as again, Ron Miller pointed out in several places, how much it is enlightenment project. And at the same time, enlightenment itself is very diverse kind of things and has forces that criticize that enlightenment project. From romantic point of view, and romantic, I mean not as some kind of label of somebody, which means utopian and so on and so forth, but in this case, romantic is something as a critique of this enlightenment project. It's almost like counter-enlightenment that almost emerge together with enlightenment, against enlightenment. It's a shadow of enlightenment. And that shadow of enlightenment, it's present there as well. But nevertheless, they never put them together and to see the contradiction between, on one hand, claiming that we're against instrumentality, at the same time, exactly doing instrumental approach, because they think that education as an instrument to solve problem in the society.
Another, so this sociologist Zygmunt Bauman has become one of my favorite writers to read because I think he puts the problem pretty well, though he doesn't frame it as enlightenment versus like romantic as much as modernism and postmodernism, which is not the same thing. But so one of the other contradictions there, I think, is the Enlightenment both brought us systems of scale, but also brought us tools to cultivate individuality. And those two can coexist to some degree, but at some point they clash. The more individualistic we acknowledge things are, the harder it is for things to scale in large systems. And the more large systems you have, the harder it is for individuality to flourish. And I was thinking about that because one of the chapters that I really wish would have been written here, the author on the first page of the first chapter mentions the word postmodern once, and he does it in quotation marks. In the middle of the first chapter, it says postmodern understandings in many fields, popular movements for human potential and spiritual renewal, and more fluid attitudes towards social and sexual mores have also entered modern culture as a result of the disruptions of the 1960s. So one of the things I find really interesting is that when we talk about like what Anna just said about like, well, what do we think of kind of the idea of education as sort of being about bringing people onto the same page and not fracturing society into these subgroups by letting everyone go their own way. Really, at the time that the free school movement was kind of experiencing its downfall in the 1970s, is when the postmodern movement started really coming about. Foucault was writing in the middle 70s. Lyotard wrote Postmodern Condition in 1979. And I think that it would have been really interesting to see I don't even know if there is a connection, but there should have been one between the idea that the postmoderns had that the way we distribute knowledge is changing, and therefore it's going to be a lot harder to keep these systems of scale as systems of scale, because everyone really will be able to go their own way. People won't be able to monopolize, like the media as much. That should have had a huge effect on making free schools seem more plausible. Because like, once you have computers and once you have the internet and once you have like a decentralized internet, and once you have all of these amazing apps that allow different people to look at different things on different screens, isn't the idea of all learners going their own way, it becomes more feasible. It becomes more plausible. I
But
don't know if anything I said made like a sense, but like I guess I'm just really interested in the idea that I don't think there was ever any sort of through line between postmodernists and like unschoolers and free schoolers, but there should have been, because the two kind of fit together pretty well, it seems like.
yeah, but at the same time, you have a rise of more and more standardization and credentialism. That was the defense, because now education becomes about getting a certificate and not about learning or anything. You just you can know whatever you want through the internet, but if it's not, stamped with an approval of some university, it doesn't count.
Yeah, I think the postmodern message is that that's going to be the last vestige of the modern era. I mean, whether they're right or not, I don't know, but I think that's kind of what Leotard was talking about, is that this will be the last gasp of the
Wasn't
modern
there
era.
also, though, an argument that he made throughout the book that, the free school movement was stuck in, well, not stuck in, but well, maybe in a romantic notion of the self? And so in that sense, the interest in what you're describing about systems wouldn't have been there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to go back and look at that again. I didn't pick that up, but again, it was a while ago since I read it. So was there a particular chapter or so that you particularly saw that?
I just remember the constant mentioning of romanticism and
Yeah, I'll look through that then. That's
yeah.
interesting.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because it also fits really nicely in with I can't help but thinking, and he doesn't dress it all that much, the psychedelic movement, and and the rise of this notion of expanded consciousness, which I sort of feel like I can't help but think might have been at the center of all this. It's just unstated because it was illegal and pushed underground. But there's a part of me that feels like a lot of that fits in nicely with the romantic vision of the self as the center of the universe, and from which all inspires and flowers. And I wonder if a lot of people were motivated by that.
Yeah, I think you're right, Mark. There is a page where he notes that some people refer to free schools as hippie schools. And if you look at the sudden rise and equally sudden fall of the so-called hippies in the late 60s and early 70s, it really parallels the rise and fall of free schools. And again, it's a fairly small percentage of people at the time who would call themselves hippies, in the same way a very small percentage were connected with free schools. And again, it's part of the fact that in the late 60s, you had this sudden surge of protest, particularly against Vietnam and around civil rights. And then by 1972, Richard Nixon gets elected in a landslide. And suddenly there are no more protests on college campuses and also on high schools. It was the strangest sudden reversal from outspoken protests to relative calm. And I think those wider currents in American society help explain a lot of what happened within the free schools.
That's very interesting. I'd like to know more about that, if anybody wrote about that. Like why so sudden reversal happened, and how was that possible? So many people advocating for radical changes and then suddenly plop.
Well, I mean, it's I never want to think of myself as like a Hegelian, but you know, when you look at history, it's hard to ignore the idea that you go to this, like this idea, and then it becomes more extreme and more extreme. And then some cracks begin to show, and it kind of brings about its antithesis. And then that becomes extreme, and then it brings about its cracks. So I mean, I haven't read recently any great like histories of the 60s and 70s, but it wouldn't surprise me if that backlash, and Bob, you probably know this better than I do. I mean, from what I recall, Nixon really played very hard on like those damn hippies. We got to crack down on those damn hippies. And like that's why the landslide occurred, because people just got very sick of hippies.
But at the same
Part of his
time,
appeal, yeah.
schools also survive, like Project Learn School, Sudbury Valley School, the Circle School. There are a number of democratic schools or semi-democratic schools that survived for a long time.
Well, I mean, survive, but if you know, I mean, history is never a monolith. So it's never like, you know, once Nixon's elected, everyone hates hippies. They're still
Right.
hippies. They're kind of like in small pockets. So I would imagine, I mean, Sudbury Valley, so it's like an enigma because it's really hard to call it a hippie school if you look at who's going there.
It's not hippie.
No, it's like bourgeois.
It's
um,
not bourgeois either, I wouldn't say.
I would say it's more bourgeois than hippie, but yeah. But yeah, I mean, so those schools survive, but they're small pockets. And I don't know. I mean, my experience with Pathfinder and Durham and some of the other schools is that, you know, it's fairly homogenous if you look at who the parents are.
Well, my feeling that it's I think about that it's mm, counterculture movement, and free school is heavily based on that. You cannot go on a position for too long. The problem is that it's required positive things, not negative things, positive things. But the positive things, they kind of try to kind to hide and not focus on developing because they were against institutions and everything. So everything that was more or less visibly stable or structural, they try to destroy and replace it to informal structure, what Jim Reitmudel called pervasive informality, which is a lot of heavy-handed power, by the way, but intentionally invisible or trying to make invisible in the school or organization itself. And this is a very so all this it's very difficult to sustain in my view. And what sustained actually was not based on that. What survived, and this is example. By the way, what you give an example, Anna, they are not free school movement. They don't
No,
call
they are not.
themselves free school.
But
Yeah,
they
some
started at the
free
same
schools
time,
survived.
but went
Yeah,
into
but
different
it's
directions.
very difficult to sustain because they based on the purity, ideological purity. They based on the enthusiastic efforts and on opposition and suppression, everything that can emerge as a kind of reified in reified ways and not based on informality. So it's very difficult, actually, project to, in a way, they created a lot of bombs, time bomb for themselves in this movement.
Mhm.
It's difficult to sustain that kind of thing on enthusiasm and on. By the way, some I've read about history of some of this free school movement. They even forbid in some schools ideological discussion or philosophical discussions because it will pull them apart. And you know, since they couldn't create a guru type of, in some places they could, by the way, in some places they created a guru, which is very often become very oppressive as guru, but it's also push things apart. You cannot deal with them as well. It's not very attractive. It becomes so closed community that it's difficult to get new members. So I
Mhm.
think it's part of this. It's a which is he didn't discuss that. That part of this disruptions they had in themselves. Besides the political time also changed, which is did not provide that synergy for them to sustain as well, because they were feeding on this on discontent. So as soon as general political discontents were getting down, they couldn't sustain themselves because they didn't build anything. It's very destructive movement, in my view.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I agree with you because I think that, and he mentions in several places, in many places actually, this, yeah, those time bombs and informality. And I was constantly thinking of Jim and the need to create a stability in the sense of how the society of the members works together. Another thing is that they were based on this idea of very tight community and communal values, and a community always implies uniformity of values, because you cannot be part of the community and loyal to the community itself with completely different value systems. So in itself, kind of like they were talking about freedom, but trying to create very oppressive informal communities.
But of course, they could do that because they can always say at the end of the day, we can't, like, we're not stopping you from leaving. So those who want to be here presumably are okay with whatever the policies are that we're setting. But yeah, there would be a contradiction if they say what we're doing is we're liberating you. But then on the other hand,
Right.
but yeah, I mean, as long as there's free entrance and exit, I guess they could say, well, we're just, these are intentional communities that are intentional because people can leave.
Right. And there I really like Eugene's article about the difference between community and the society. And I think that the idea that democratic schools had was an idea of having a society of multiple values and ideas and goals, where people have a lot of a lot of personal rights, but for the communal life, there must be a possibility of debating and making decisions about what to do. So the decisions that are codified in a certain way, like through their JC, through their laws and things like that, so that nobody is above and nobody has this informal power.
Mhm.
I guess that sort of touches on the debate in like political philosophy about whether liberalism is the absence of a politics that allows for different politics within it, or whether it itself is a politics. I guess I've always been on the side that in some sense it has to be politics. Because as soon as you talked about Anna, you talked about like, cool, you can kind of create a society that's about people being very different, but you have to first assign everyone a certain set of rights. Well, what if those rights are contested? At some point, someone has to be able to say, no, these are the rights that we have to have, otherwise this doesn't work, which means you set up at least some minimal form of politics.
Right.
Mhm.
And you have to be aware of that. And I think education from all other human practices has a duality in itself, because on one hand, you have to make decisions of practical value, like things cannot be both this and that. If you have to make what are you buying, what projects you're doing, how you're living, what's fair, what's not fair in the justice system. But on the other hand, you have to have an arena for these diverse ideas to freely be debated and contested at the same way. So I think of education as not completely really a activity as any kind of like a production activity would be or work, but having it's about a ideas as much as it is about life. But they come into the needs of one and the other are opposed, and I think best so far solved in agreeing that people have rights to different ways of learning and different understanding of what's useful and different values, but at the same time they have responsibility in the practical life of not oppressing other people. Right.
Another important thing which is difficult to sustain, um, all this counterculture free school movement based on idea of rejection of authority.
Mhm.
And I don't think you can, and nevertheless, authority was there. And which is again, elephant in the room. And instead of thinking about, okay, which authority is legitimate, which is not legitimate, there is a lot of attempts to try to kill any emergence of authority or hide it rather than discuss exactly in open discussion what kind of authority is good, under what conditions, and under what conditions is bad. Again, this authority was very strongly present. By the way, you mentioned, Kevin, this Albany Free School. It's actually very clear seeing these authority things, adult authority specifically, and in some cases, arguably very illegitimate, that emerging on the assembly meetings. And I'm talking about the video that they produced, right? But these issues, which can be discussed in democratic schools, like is it legitimate, not legitimate, in sense of what do we like that type of authority, adult authority or not, almost like become censored in these free school movements, intentionally invisible, because we committed to not having authority.
Mhm. And that's very dangerous because there's a big potential for abuse there. And there's a little bit of a hint of that in the book when they talked about adults, for example, and their ideological interests in, for example, sending kids out to protests, or also I'm also concerned about sexual abuse and emotional abuse and other things that I'm sure were kind of lingering there, that weren't. There's a lot of like, because the breakdown of the authority is such too that there's sort of there's not a clear separation between let's say adult and child, and other things that kind of alarming in some ways.
I mean, authority is kind of a double-edged sword, though. Like, there are definitely dangers of authority, especially in its abuse, especially in its monopolistic effects. But one thing that I suspect that the free school movement didn't really think about or agree with or whatever, that I think is responsible for part of the backlash, is there's equally a danger when there's a vacuum of authority in a lot of ways. Some systems need coordination, and the coordination has to come from the top. It can't come from below unless especially if it's a larger system. So yeah, I suspect that's probably also why people got fed up in some ways with the hippies, as we go back to, like, the Nixon backlash. But
One thing, sorry to jump on that, because it's just like Mark, you reminded me, because you wrote about something very important, and it's there. It's about feel good. And as a marker of authenticity.
yeah,
I think this is where I would say Kevin, bourgeois middle class culture very powerful in the counterculture, and it's interesting they don't see it. You can make a search on the feel good, and Ron actually put it in italics. This is in the quote of I think John Holt, at least
Yes,
one thing, but I think it's
page
appears several
100.
times. Page
Yeah.
100, yeah. And I think it was in another place as well, somewhere, I remember. But you can make a search on the just document, just put feel good. And it's interesting how this notion of authenticity and this hippie one, it's more about authenticity equal feel good and kind of pleasurable thing, which is also a kind of a liberation, a part of liberation. If I kind of feel good, it means it's good. Also, it's kind of destroying the notion of civilization, because civilization is exactly opposite to that. By the way, this theme is going throughout whole. It's everything is artificial. But culture is artificial. This is notion. Definition of culture is exactly it's making art.
humans
Out
are
of it.
artificial.
It's
Here is-
artificial by the things. It's not natural. There is
Yeah.
nothing natural in culture.
as we say with
And
our
it's
glasses
so
on.
interesting that they couldn't see that through. By the way, Ron is not reflecting on that. Although I think he felt that, but not reflecting. He put in italics, but not discussing that, this feel good
Mhm.
things. Or
Mhm.
artificial or phony. Or something is phony. Everything is phony. Like saying hello is phony.
Yeah.
Like, let me tell you, it's in another language. When you start learning another language, it's become very visible to you.
Mm.
Like, for example, when I just came to United States, an email emerged. I was receiving messages and I start, good day. And
Yeah.
I was like trying to read carefully message and trying to figure out like what's good about that day. The person is saying it's good day. It means something eventful happened. And I couldn't find that. And I was like, what's wrong? Like, where is that? What I'm missing there? And then I realized, oh, it's just like in Russian, I'm using that all the time. It's just like it was set in a little bit differently, different way, but it's the same thing. It's just like it's artificial, phony thing,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
extremely important for social lubrication as a culture. Very important. And the fact that it's artificial, it's great that it's artificial. But yes, I understand what they're talking about, but there's zero reflection. It's not because it's artificial, it's a problem. It's a problem with how, like, what kind of artificiality is good and what is bad.
And what's the
And
use of the
discussion
artificial?
of that is absolutely absent from that movement.
But
Yeah.
even labeling it artificial is 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 pushing against what we understand human communication to do within culture. So I'm wondering whether that is a term that is useful in this discussion, since language functions in a way in what we're looking at through our individual lenses, and mine through sociolinguistic and critical sociolinguistic lenses, that these phadic communications, these ways of creating unity, solidarity, alliances, um, is labeled artificial, doesn't recognize that it is part of a cultural way of using language. And I
Yeah.
know that you know this, but I just think the label is not appropriate in this case, because I really liked your comments, the group's comments or discussion around what is authentic. And this notion of authenticity means also conflict. And so dealing with conflict should be part of the free school orientation if it's meant to be a way of understanding um, dialogue as not always producing consensus. And so the phadic communication, the I recognize you, I hear you, I see you, is not always authentic, but it is one of a group's ways of acknowledging your presence. And so this kind of communication, I think, is important. When I see discussion about authenticity, is somebody's cultural notion of authentic is being applied here. What
Mhm.
is it that is being applied here?
I
And
mean, yeah.
go ahead.
Well, I went back to read I forget which of Abe Maslow's books where he really gets into what the idea of self-actualization is, which is a revealing phrase in of itself, a self that is there to be actualized. And I made note of all of the normative evaluations, to Eugene's point, and I think to your point, that go into his idea of what authentic is. And yeah, number one, they're all feel good. Number two, they are all spontaneous. If there's any sort of planning.
Mhm.
Number three, they're all individual in the sense of once you're socially strategizing, and strategizing sounds like a really pernicious thing, but like every time I walk down the hall and not bump into people, I'm strategizing. So like if it is premeditated, it's not authentic somehow.
Hmm.
And that just really like sort of begs the question, like it's like, so if someone is like a people pleaser and they will sort of calibrate themselves to the people that they're around, right? The proponent of Maslow is going to be like, stop being inauthentic. And they're like, but what if that is me? Like, what if that literally is the me that I want to be? They're going to say that, well, you're being phony. It's like, so now you're just normatively saying you should be this change. And you're trying to make it like a descriptive statement. So I don't know like how far that goes to answering the question, but like I went back and I read Maslow, and I was really interested, number one, in how normative his theory is, and number two, based on the histories that I've read, how few people in that movement saw it as normative. But it's just so obviously normative from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Very interesting, yeah. But I think it's all part of this really monistic understanding that there is one truth or one set of non-conflicting values. And it becomes normative because of that, because we all know what it should be, or we all know that there should be something that we should know, that there is this truth above all the truth, or goodness above all the goodness, and that we cannot see or even legitimize a different something that for us is completely like not understandable or even disgusting. But some people and groups hold dear to themselves.
Mhm.
One thing that I wanted to bring up, unless there's someone else who has something on that track,
Yeah, bring it up.
I can hold it. Okay. So especially when he's talking about the kind of corollaries, the cultural corollaries and predecessors to free schooling and democratic schooling, one of the things he didn't really mention that I've seen mentioned elsewhere is the philosophy of existentialism, which my understanding, especially in the early 70s, was definitely in the air. In fact, there's two books. Rob, I'm guessing Bob probably knows of these books. Eugene may know of them. Some other, like Anna may know about them. They're both called Existentialism in Education. They're written by two different authors. They're part of two different book series. So like one of them was like there's progressivism in education. I think it was like naturalism in education. So big philosophical movements, and then existentialism in education. And the other one is just a book that was written. And so the reason I see, like, so both of these books actually mention free schools and I think one in particular, John Holt, as like examples of existentialism in education. But when you look at like the rhetoric that people like John Holt and Dan Greenberg use, a lot of it is very existentialist. They talk about like the learner has like responsibility and there's no external authority to look to decide your values and stuff like that. That's a very, very existentialist notion, particularly with Sartre, but also with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche with self-creation and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't really mention existentialism, and I'm not entirely convinced because I don't have enough evidence to say that existentialism was a big factor in some of these discussions coming up. But again, two books that are called Existentialism in Education, which are designed as part of one of which is designed as part of a series that teachers would read, mentions existentialism and mentions the idea that Holt and like I think Summerhill are like examples of what existentialism in education would look like. So I don't know. I mean, does anyone have any ideas on how large an influence existentialism had on this?
He mentioned, Kevin, to his credit, he mentioned 3 times the word
Oh, he did.
existentialism and maybe a little bit more existential. I
Oh,
think
yeah,
he
it
mentioned
worked.
that he didn't develop it well, but I agree with you. But I think he mentioned, and that's good things that at least he mentions.
I'll do a
He didn't
keyword
go
on that
deeper in
then.
that.
He
Yeah.
kind of equates it with wholeness, though, and authenticity.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that's another
Yeah.
big concept
Yeah.
in existentialism. That's both Kierkegaard and Sartre and
Yeah.
Beauvoir.
And you
Yeah.
mentioned, Eugene, on the Facebook where you said that you don't like the whole free movement that was too existential.
Yeah.
So I'd really like to know more about it because I really don't know much. Like, in what way was the free school movement influenced by existentialism, and what is actually existentialism?
Well, existentialism, yeah, I've done some relatively deep reading in it. Existentialism is a cluster of philosophies, some atheistic, some theistic, that have to do with the idea of what the world must look like and how we must live when either there is a God and that God is pretty silent, or there is no God and you realize that you have to be the bearer of responsibility for your own choices, actions, the values you accept. There's no like objective way to do that. And they answered the question somewhat differently. But so some of the parallels of existentialism to free schooling and unschooling are things like, I mean, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Sartre were all big into this idea that, as Sartre says, existence precedes essence. There is no essential you aside from what you make yourself. So you're born, you probably have a set of traits, but within that, you get to decide who you're going to be. And like your experiences can go this way or that way or this way or that way. There's a lot of potential selves that you could be. And it's kind of up to you to make that happen. I mean, another one is sort of authenticity, the idea that in order to live correctly, they were all very individualistic philosophers, except for Martin Buber. The idea that you must live in a sense like truly. The idea of like bad faith was Sartre's idea of kind of like living in ways that evade responsibility because you subordinate your authority over yourself to someone else. And you say, oh, I don't have control over this. I don't have responsibility for that choice. This person made me do it. So the idea of authenticity is the acceptance of responsibility for the burden of choice. I mean, stuff like that is what I see in the free school and democratic school movement. That parallels.
Also, I would add to that. Sorry, gosh, something in my a frog in my throat. I would add to that also to focus on more on intrinsic values. Exactly in opposition to technological and instrumental concerns and goals. Focus on intrinsic values, on of the anything. In this case, in education, intrinsic values of education. The reason I'm opposed to that, which is surprised, right? Like, oh, by the way, the same thing, the education should be always meaningful, for example. Statements or learning should be always meaningful. By the way, it's another interesting thing that there is no separation learning from education in this, but it's another story. And I'm taking an issue with that because I don't think that learning should be always meaningful. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. And there's nothing wrong with that. By the way, this is what Tolstoy was struggled with that. And again, because I'm talking about Tolstoy because I just finished working on this piece, and for me, everything resonates in that mass reading that I did, historical reading of Tolstoy on education. He struggled with it a lot, but to the credit, to Tolstoy's credit, this is huge. Like, this is where I'm really almost like bowing to Tolstoy. You know, he was always ready to to acknowledge that the student has right to define everything for themselves, even if it's a disagreement with Tolstoy's great ideas. Let me give just one example how much you will understand. So Tolstoy is like, by the time he started doing this and engaged in this pedagogical experiments, he was a great Russian writer, maybe not internationally known back then. He was in his early 30s only, but he already wrote big pieces that become very famous. He became very famous in Russia. So he's a writer, right? And he defined interested for you, it will be very interesting even to know, like, definition of what's the purpose of literacy education. And of course, purpose of literacy education is to engage in literary work, deeply engage in literary work. Of course, that's for the writer. It's funny that he is not listening himself how much, like, for, like for the hammers, everything is a nail. For writer, of course, everything is a literary work. And by the way, he was working with the peasants who were just a few years before that. Were his slaves, by the way. That's important. So he's working with the peasants. And by the way, children and adults. And some of the adults specifically, and he writes about that, took, learning, reading and writing completely from instrumental, super instrumental form. And he is mechanical, what he called mechanical. And he is very upset with that. But at the end of the day, he said, well, who am I to decide what they needed? They like people capable. I might disagree with them. I think it's maybe not efficient from my point of view. But if they decide to do that, let it be. And I have to stay off that. And I need to support that. They come to me to support. And I cannot just say, stop doing your goal, start doing this goal. I might share with that about that. But if they not want to listen to me, that's fine. That's what I'm a teacher. I need to help them in their goals. And by the way, that's things that is constantly present in Tolstoy writing about how much students surprised him, pleasantly and unpleasantly. It's absolutely absent in this kind of work, at least Ron Miller presented. These things that coming from practice that disrupts the ideology. And people willing to accept that disruption and actually not only accept, but almost celebrate that, even it's very, very painful and unpleasant.
Just
Definitely, Tolstoy not was about feel good things. He was not feel good. Like, for example, it was written on his school, you are free to come and go at any time. And kids and adults were doing that. Imagine that in the middle of the lessons, the peasant children and adults were leaving the lessons. And he said it's very unpleasant for the teacher. And he said, I experienced that. But I will never stop doing that because that's the beauty of this.
It's legitimizing the others, yes.
Yeah.
So I have a question then about Summerhill that he puts here within this, or at least as inspiration for the movement and a lot of philosophy, but I still find Summerhill different than his schools. In a sense, whether they whether A.S. Neil and the whole philosophy of Summerhill was much more democratic than free school movement.
Of course, because again, children and students can define their education, and it can be instrumental. By the way, it was in many ways very instrumental. It was okay. It's students define the purposes, what they want to study, for what purpose, and when and why. Which is so there was not that imposition on this kind of ideas like what's the purpose of education, and you have to do it, and should become and blah 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 blah, all of that kind of thing, and authentic, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, very interesting.
I don't know if this helps answer the question, but you know, I went down some rabbit holes when I was kind of researching this stuff, and I have no idea how to package all of it, but I feel like I should at some point. One of the things about A.S. Neil that's really interesting is, you know, his writings are definitely mired in this really odd variation of psychoanalysis that puts a lot of emphasis on like sex as expression and stuff like that. And it's kind of odd until you realize that he was very deep friends with a psychologist named Wilhelm Reich.
Yeah.
And Wilhelm Reich was renegade would be the polite way to put it. Crazy would be the real way to put it. No, I'm just kidding. Reich did a book called Character Analysis. And he did another book very related called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. And in both books, he has this very firm idea of like a true self. So the idea is that the self when you're born essentially is like the self that is like the best self to kind of maintain. And like the purpose of childhood and stuff should be to maintain that self. And what happens is when you experience like trials and tribulations through like the artifice of culture, to go back to what, you know, Eugene kind of was talking about, you develop this, what he calls character armor. And the purpose of trying to, the way to find your true self is to identify all of those defenses that we call character armor and strip them away so that you can become sort of your natural self the way you would have been if you would have just continued your childlike whatever in the present. But he also had this very crazy fascination with sex that got him into a lot of trouble. So I don't know, like there's a book collection of letters from and to A.S. Neil back and forth with Wilhelm Reich. And I think Wilhelm Reich wrote something for like on behalf of Summerhill at some point. And I'd love to, I haven't yet read it, but I have to imagine that Neil's fascination with sex as expression comes from Reich. But it's interesting to note that Reich, who, Neil was very influenced by, had that notion of the true self, and all you need to do is strip away all the artifices, and you have your true self. So I don't know if that shows up.
And
Yeah.
that was in the book too. It was very interesting how that gets connected with the free speech movement, a free school movement.
Yeah.
That book Summerhill sold, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of copies in just a short period of time. Everybody was reading it. And what's interesting is that what I found really interesting was this comment in the book about how one of the reasons that the schools failed was because the teachers themselves needed to discover their true self, and they found what they discovered what they in a sense, the defense that a lot of the free schools were founded on the idea of breaking down defenses, like breaking down the students' defenses to discover their authentic self. And then at the same time, the adults themselves are doing the same thing. So in some ways, it's almost like a giant group therapy effort to discover one's defenses, which in many ways seems quite unsafe and highly chaotic. And one can imagine the consequences of doing such a thing, and the amount of how to put it, but the amount of what's the word I'm looking for?
Vulnerability?
Well, no, not liability. I'm more
No,
severe.
vulnerability.
Yeah, well, yeah, but in the sense of like, you're like, I remember this one comment in the book that really struck me. It was that teachers were revealing things about themselves that they felt uncomfortable doing, something like this. I can't remember exactly how it was worded. And that they were, like talking about things about themselves to students that they may not have talked about otherwise, or and it's sort of like becomes almost like, imagine the sense of shame and guilt one discovers when they are in a place where there's no ground rules. Like I'm just thinking about how much this is different from, let's say, the safety one would encounter in a therapy group, where, for example, or in a 12-step group, where there's a set of traditions that one upholds a sense of anonymity, for example, so that you don't discuss the stuff outside of the room. Like, there's a lot of like care being taken to ensure that there isn't a and that is really not present here. So I perceive anyway, a lot of these free schools is just being horrific. And this is not really detailed very much, but one would imagine would be really interesting to find would be case studies of experiences in that regard. I remember this one video that Eugene and I actually saw. It was absolutely fascinating, and I found it again recently, but I didn't do anything with it. It was a video on we were in Amsterdam, I remember. You remember this, Eugene? And we uncovered this video in this museum.
Oh, you got it?
I managed to find it. Yeah.
Mark,
What's the
please.
video about?
Oh, gosh.
How to describe it? It was
Well, I can
absolute
describe
mass
that.
chaos of
Actually, I was
parenting.
writing to that museum to get it, and we almost agree, and something fall apart. It's in Amsterdam. There was Museum of Childhood, which is very interesting idea to have Museum of Childhood. It's still there, but unfortunately, second time when I came there, that video was not there. It's actually was shot in my understanding in 60s in Germany and Netherlands. Mark, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
In one of it's called, by the way, it's called Holy Family.
Holy Family. That's it.
Yeah, I remember the title.
That's it.
It's about this experimentation in parenting in 60s. Like, for example, that it's a communal life and everybody is supposed to be naked there all the time. and children and adults. And which is very physically engaged with each other and doing some kind of fun activities, whatever fun can be defined that. I always wanted to watch it again, and this is like Mark, when was like
apparently
more
it
than
ended
20
up
years ago.
on, I found it several years ago and I just like, I don't know what happened. Something happened
Mark,
in my
send it
life
to
or
me.
something.
You need to refind
I'll
that
try
again.
to, I'll try to uncover it. It might have been an old drive, but I found, and it was actually rebroadcast on Dutch television. And yeah.
Please, we need that.
Oh,
By the way, I
interesting.
suspect that one possibility, what might so difficult to find it now, I've learned about in Germany about that because some think shootings were in Germany, and some later kids were actually suing either their parents or whatever for sexual abuse that coming from these communities. By the way, when I'm saying that, I'm not sure that the video is like involved or not, but I at least now understand why it was very careful to show that again, because of these allegations, and not only allegation, because they won. As far as I know, they won the case. By the way, also not only with the or their own parents, but some other adults, including teachers as well, because they try to create these educational communities as well. And some of them were really also foster care. There is part of this foster care kind
Yeah.
of based on this sexual freedom.
Yeah.
No, it
The
is
whole
a
this
very
movement.
interesting question. It forms in my mind how much this free school movement and this whole movement of the new left in the world is connected to also the German Schwarze Pädagogik or black pedagogy, or exactly denazification of schools through this freedom, and some of them were really also very much involved with the kind
You
of
mean
like
in the GDR particularly?
yeah,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
their life, yeah. And that was about the same time, I think,
Hmm.
going on.
Mhm.
Right. So this whole liberation of education or childhood and freedom went through that similar kind of like, but in very different ways in United States and in Germany, I think. So such an interesting thing.
It seems to fall into a kind of stereotype of Germans being uptight about sexual relations.
Well, my understanding is that in East Germany in particular was very um
Mhm.
sexually how to put it?
Opposed.
No, the opposite.
Oh,
Mhm.
East Germany
Yeah.
was not
And
as
There
there is
was a
a wonderful
movement in
documentary
Germany,
about that.
very strong naturalist movement, even before the
Yeah.
Second World War, and the cult of the human body, the naked body, and a lot of naturalists or nudists, if you want to translate it into something like that survived the war, and through the war and the 60s and 70s and 80s, at least in Yugoslavian coasts, were full of German naked people. There were a lot of nudist beaches, and predominantly it was Germans and Dutch people, the Danish people, like that, this kind of like Northern Europe people who were like craving this free. It's really naturalist movement because it's a whole ideology again about the wholeness with nature, being together with nature, being natural, not phony. Naked comes the first thing, free sex and all of that.
Hmm. And also, it was a way for the East Germans to probably grow their state. They probably saw a positive aspect to it in that sense.
I don't think East Germans were coming to Yugoslavia. West Germans were coming.
Oh, I thought it was East Germans.
No. East Germans were behind the curtain, and Yugoslavia was not behind.
Oh, I see. Okay.
See, this just starts to make me think of, I mean, he mentions it a few times, like the kind of liberalization of sexual mores. It makes me wonder, like, how related like if the invention of easily accessible birth control had not come about, would those mores have not loosened? And to that degree that they played into ideas about free schooling, would the free schooling movement have taken shape very differently? It's just like, as someone who tries to think historically, it's just, I wonder like how far that argument would go.
Mm-hmm.
Because I
Yeah.
mean, there've been a lot of people who argue that the idea of like free love and stuff just would not have become a popular idea had there not also concurrently been the liberalization of birth control. But
You also,
then the question of like, if the liberalization of our sexual mores was sort of a correlate of free schooling, to the degree it was, I don't know, would it have taken shape differently had there not been a liberalization of birth control?
And that whole feminist movement at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
so how does it relate to not expanding understandings of racial and ethnic communities, where free schools open-minded in those days to also allow for non-European Americans, white Americans, to participate in them? And Anna, you bring up the question of feminism,
Yeah.
I'm wondering how that affected their orientations to gender diverse students.
I
Did
don't know I don't know of that in particular. I don't think they were closed to these ideas, but I don't think they were near their kind of like center of their rhetoric.
Yeah, I think everything that has been mentioned so far seems to have different repercussions among the African American communities, and also in with women joining or gender identity, diverse gender identities, um, participating in either free school or even in the I don't know how Summerhill was open to people of diverse backgrounds. I see many of the innovations in education as being options offered to those who have more economic means. And we see this happening in the dual language movement right now, where there's quite a bit of gentrification of schools that were supposed to recognize the the linguistic and cultural diverse communities with a place to show those resources that are in those communities, and the students who are from those communities having less option or fewer options to participate in these schools that are supposedly
But that
creating.
was what, yeah, one of the big critiques of the proponents of public education, and then Kozul joined them, and all of them, that the free school movement is kind of breaking up possibility for changing the public education, and that it's just becoming elitist because it's private, and not everybody can afford that. And so that was a big critique. On the other hand, I think so. That's another issue that we didn't discuss, that people who reverted to kind of defending public education in the name of equal opportunity for everyone and change of the society uh, did a kind of sleight of hand, in my view, because practically speaking, public education was moving toward the really standardization and unification of everything, no matter what they particularly were trying to say that they are for, like progressive education, and they were defending something that in their time and in our time still, after how many now years after all of that, it's still moving into direction of actually standardization of education. So if you say free schools or even democratic schools are not giving opportunity for diverse communities, especially those that are not affluent, it's not their fault. It's the fault of the public school that's free, or the way how the allocation of the money for education is given to only one kind of ideology, which at this moment is not yet on that level to accept the diversity. It's kind of like if we should be equal, even if that equality should be on the lowest possible level of misery.
So,
Let me add to that. It's a kind of, in my view, it's unfair criticism of free school movements for several reasons. One thing, they really try to penetrate public education, initially in 60s and 70s, early 70s, with mixed success. There is some public districts actually allow created a shelter over the free schools, free schools, incorporating them in the public education. But very soon they become hostile to that idea and they cut that. But some survived for some time. That's one thing. Another thing, some free school, even private schools, try to make efforts to incorporate a very diverse population, and they're still doing that. For example, Albany, one of the good examples, it's Albany Free School, and many other, especially urban schools, like Free School in Philadelphia. I visited them. It's mostly African American in terms of the population. They try to, since it's private schools, they really try to make big efforts to reduce tuition or make a lot of scholarship available and so on and so forth. And in a way, it was become a catch-22. Well, this type of school pushed in the privates, and then they criticized for being private. Well, it's is it like a problem of public schools not diversifying and not allow this kind of diversity happen within public school umbrella? It's almost like it's interesting things. And of course, if you look at when schools are private, it's very difficult to be there for low-income people. But even with when there is any efforts to incorporate them, there is limitations with that, of course. But should it be they blame for that? I don't think so. I think on average, from what I know and reading this book as well, supports my view. There was a lot of efforts to address that issue. How successful they are and successful, I would love to see scholarship on more systematic basis to look at this issue, which is very important. In terms of the other question about feminism, I'm not sure. And I think Ron actually wrote in the book addressing that very briefly, that issue, that yes, they're interested about race and socioeconomic issue, they were very focused, but how he wrote that feminism almost emerged or almost was on the side effect or something like that. I forgot exactly if somebody remembers that, let me know. But he almost like it's kind of almost like become byproduct of this focus on civil rights, but not a primary things, which is interesting because feminist movement was a big part of this civil rights movements in 60s. It maybe indeed came late a little bit than others, but not by much. But it's interesting that he made that a very, I would say, interesting qualifier. And it's interesting how true what he writes, that feminism almost like was on the side
Yeah.
of this kind
There's
of.
actually no word feminism in the whole book. I just made a search.
He used that something. Maybe it's like women's issue or something like that. He used that, unless it's my false memory. Of course, it's possible as well. I never exclude that. But I think I actually it attracted my attention that he mentioned something like that.
The feminist
Uh,
perspective. Let's search on another because there is okay. So if I
It's called the feminist.
while you're doing that, I'm going to offer a little bit of a different take
Mhm.
on this because I hear a lot of talking about for some, with
Yeah,
some
yeah.
justification, the idea of the economics idea of when you're a private school, you can obviously, it's a barrier to low income people. But that would only become racialized if you equate, let's say, Black with low income. And statistically, I mean, there's overrepresentation, but there's a lot of bougie Black people in the world and in the country. So, okay, so story from when I was at the Pathfinder School in Durham, North Carolina. So one of the bits of our mission was that we aspired to have a enrollment that essentially matched the diversity of Durham, North Carolina. And essentially that was kind of code word for, I mean, a few things, but white and Black, because both groups are represented pretty well in Durham. And we found that we really did not sell very well to Black people. So not only did Black people not come in for tours or inquire about us, but the few who did decided not to go. So we went through a whole lot of unpacking about why that was. This was, in the aftermath of some very high profile murders and other racially questionable incidents. So there's a lot of talk about, should we decolonize the curriculum? Should we become more explicitly anti-racist, et cetera? And I made a suggestion that we actually try to get survey data on what Black people wanted in their education. And nobody did that. We just assumed that we knew what was best. So I always thought that was kind of weird. And so we disbanded without ever figuring out the problem because of COVID. But a little while later, I came across some research by an anthropologist named Michelle Gelfand. And she divides cultures into, roughly speaking, what are called tight cultures and loose cultures. Loose cultures are very liberal, they're very individualistic, the rules are usually flexible, stuff like that. Tight cultures are the ones that value oftentimes like hierarchy, authority, regularity, things like that. And one thing she said in that book that I kind of was thinking at the time we were having this question at Pathfinder was, she said, according to survey data, African-American and Hispanic-American groups tend to score pretty high on the tight cultural side in terms of their attitudes. And one of the possible explanations for that is that when you are in a system that already discriminates against you, you don't necessarily have the luxury to be like, well, I'll be free and I'll do what I want, because if I don't, like, it'll be fine. Like, I can figure it out. You're like, no, I have to do everything by the book, because if I don't, I drop down even further in status. And when I read that, I was like, I bet if Pathfinder would have actually looked for survey data, we would have found that maybe Black people in our area simply did not want our service because it didn't resonate with them. They're like, yeah, like we're 100 and some years from a society where it was illegal to educate us, and now you're trying to convince us that the best education is not explicit education, right?
Yes, I
Or
agree.
that there's
I
no,
had-
or to make the community behind us
had-
invisible, which gives us our strength. So in a way, there's that aspect to it as well, I find.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, well, that discussion has been in the sociolinguistic and literacy world since the 60s. And I think that trying to enter a society that doesn't, or a social group that doesn't embrace your authenticity, is a difficult navigational path. And so, to what degree do you have to also expand your repertoires to embrace that which oppresses you? And to what degree do you have to maintain some authenticity to change the boundaries? I think Elisa Del Pitt wrote about the kinds of movements to teach in more, I would say, flexible ways of literacy, especially in writing. And we see this recurring today in the systemic functional linguistic community that's trying to teach the norms of certain genres by the linguistic arrangement of texts of text through cohesive and coherence devices that work with lexiosemantic and grammatical types of uh, of of arrangements. But the question is, to what extent does it have to one has to bend and be flexible and expand. And I think some communities are not tight cultures and loose cultures, but I mean, that's a cute term, but I would say to what extent the oppressive and acceptance of those repertoires exist. But I see we're out of time and everyone is leaving, but I do think free schools have a socioeconomic connection to the communities and have been um, of interest of mine, and I will probably read more about it.
Can I comment on that, or Teresa, what you said, because it's very interesting for me. What's interesting for me is a interesting contradiction between their insistence on organism, everything is organic, which is flexible, self-organizing, and so on and so forth, and rigidity, ideological rigidity.
I
This
can
is what,
understand
again,
that.
such a contrast between Tolstoy and them. Like Tolstoy, for example, he was so much shocked by uh, peasant resistance to literature that he, refined literature that he accustomed, and he was part of that. That he was start challenging, questioning himself of value of that refined literature. Versus peasant literature, peasant sensitivities to the artistic forms. But you see, for me, Tolstoy was organic because, it's, all this naturalism, which he also was very much committed, and organic transformations, which he was committed, shaped his foundation because he came to the people who had very different sensibilities within the practice, the most important practice for him, which was literature. And he was open to that. And I don't see that in free movement whatsoever. That's, sensibilities to sensitivity to the others who might come with different sensibilities, like what we're talking about right now. And adjust to them, or at least start debating, discuss. Wait a minute, maybe I'm biased about that, or maybe like why it should be my version rather than their version of that. First of all, it become clear, see contrast, and not between right and wrong, but about trying to say why is it they have this one, why I have that. Okay, and which one should be prioritized and why? And for Tolstoy, he answering that question because that school is not for me. That school is for these peasant children and adults. That's why I have to do something about that. I need to focus on their needs, not my needs, not my sensibilities. And he even started raising big issue about his values in general. I don't see that happening there.
Mm.
No, and I was thinking very often how much the whole movement, practice and ideology was within what Berlin was calling positive freedom, that you define what's freedom for the other.
Yeah.
And if it's somebody other's business, then it's a negative freedom. You cannot predefine what that should mean for them. Freedom or anything else, what's education for them, what's good for them, or whatever. And so it's a paradigmatically different view of whole education if you put it in the negative freedom of Berlin. And the reason I think with for all our criticism, not the criticism of the others, progressives from like Kozulin, or Kozul, what was his name? But the criticism is that, yeah, they are really staying within the paradigm that came from the Enlightenment and try to twist it, but they could not really twist it in a way that that could survive. For a while it was, but it really became like a monster in itself, I would say.
Mhm. And the last thing that maybe, I don't know, is it the last or because it's probably time to go, but I was thinking about normativity, and normativity, in my view, in itself is not a bad thing, but they should be open for discussion, for first of all, realization that this is candidate for the norm. Should it be a candidate for the norm? Or like, how can we revise that later? And so on and so forth. All of this is absolutely not present in the discourse. It's because everything is axiom for them, like authenticity, like what we're problematizing right now. It's very difficult for them to problematize. They will probably suppress us. They will call labels on us, like we are bourgeois, whatever back then labels. We are fascists, by the way, because the fascists was a big word there, not communism. How terrible it was. It's almost not there, and it's left. Which is you're supposed to be concerned about issues like that. No, fascism was the bad thing. Okay, so we will be probably fascist because just for challenging this or bringing up, is it good or is it bad? But I think without that discourse about that, without dialogue, but not even discourse, but dialogue about that, it's become very oppressive. So I'm not for the against completely normativity. I'm for a normativity that is open for discussion, for first of all, like the same thing about authority. It's not necessarily a bad word, authority or normativity or whatever. It's just like it's monopoly on that. That's what creates this. And they created this monopoly while rejecting everything else. They created this very oppressive authority while fighting the authority.
And I
Mhm.
think that that's quite often the case in many schools where principals make decisions without the consideration of teachers' perspectives or teachers and teachers and students and parents. I think this is all part of the problem that arises. How to deal with conflict is not a good, how should I say, there's not a good one single solution for dealing with all of these conflicts and positionalities and opinions. And I think this, when you say there should be dialogue, there should be discourse about it, some people do not feel the they have either the stamina or the energy or the resources to stay within that dialogue. And
Mhm.
so some people are pushed out, some people use their currency, their capital for different ways and go against the school. Some leave, some involuntarily get pushed out. And so we have, what do we do with the situation of conflict and at public education, or in private education you just get left out, and that's okay, you can leave. Well, you can take your money elsewhere, you can take your capital elsewhere. At any rate, I know that we're over, and I'm sorry
Yes.
that I've taken us further over, but thank you for a wonderful discussion. And
Thank you
Eugene,
for having
I like the term that you used, but you said it very quickly about this persuasive power that
informality.
Informality, not persuasive.
info,
Yeah, not
just the
is it no. Uh,
Pervasive,
what's the, huh?
Pervasive.
pervasive
Pervasive.
informality.
yes. Who was the, I'm sorry, pervasive informality,
Informality, yeah.
but
Just
it
a
had,
sec. I will put in the I let me open the document and I will put this just a sec.
It's Jim Rietmulder, who is the founder of the Circle School in Harrisburg, a democratic school. In his book, When Kids Rule, about that school, and he discusses that it was a big revelation. The lack of actually rules and norms that were created by the community creates this possibility of pervasive
pervasive, yeah.
informality, which creates hidden authorities and hidden powers that are never in check because they are like an elephant in the room. And I always remember my sister-in-law who went to live in Israel criticized the kibbutz, the so-called egalitarian communities, because she says, and that was, she went in the late 80s and 90s. And by that time, it was already a history of the kibbutz. Many families lived there for a long time, a second, third generation. And she said that they are talking about egalitarian things in kibbutz. Who are they fooling? There is one or two families who rule everything.
Right. And this is I think is one of the things that we call democratic schooling and public education. And there's one or two people who are not sharing the dialogue. They're dialoguing, but they're not sharing it with others. And I think it's beautiful. It's a beautiful concept for me because I see this being used all the time in authoritarian, let's be chummy, but I'm making all the rules. Let's be friendly, but I'm making all the rules. And that coercive power is invisible. I think it's very difficult to, as you say, check. It's very
It's the same. It's the same authoritative structure of a cult in many ways. I feel. Yeah.
Can you say that again, Mark? I didn't hear you.
I guess this is how cults operate.
Cults.
How
I was just thinking
Cults.
cults.
cult
Yeah.
operates. Okay, yes, yes. And
What's interesting that I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm just reading the quote. It's interesting that he's exactly criticizing free school. I just forgot about that. That whole comment is about free school that Jim wrote. Jim read Moodle.
Many
Moodler.
preschools
So
sought
it's
to
very
eliminate
interesting
her.
that it's just about our focus of our discussion. It's not about something else, but about that particular thing.
And then he says, in contrast, democratic schools in this book are about formal structure and formal authority, meaning structure and authority are visible, valued, acknowledged, and documented.
And one thing is not there in the last thing. Also debated and made democratic decision about that as well. What missing? I wish he added to that. It's not just visible, valued, acknowledged, and documented, but also debated, problematized, and make democratic decision about that.
thank you so much. This was very rich discussion, and I'm glad I was able to listen in, maybe not contribute very much, but I
Your
learned
questions were really great. And
Oh,
your
you did exactly what you're supposed to do. You ask excellent questions, Teresa.
thank you. Thank you for having this space to engage.
Thank you. Okay, hopefully to see you later as well. Bye. Bye,
Bye.
Mark.
Bye-bye,
Mark,
Mark.
don't forget to send the video. Find that video,
Yeah,
Mark.
I gotta
Please.
find it. You know what happened was that I was on at some point I was thinking about that movie. I don't know why, and I tried to figure out what the title of it was, and I found it. And then I did a little Google search and discovered that it had been posted on the Dutch website, and I was able to, through VPN, to download it because I had to be
So
in
it's on your
Holland.
computer, Mark. It's on your
Yeah,
computer now.
it's not on my existing computer, but I believe it's on a backup drive that I have. So I'm going to go through it when I get home. I have to go to work now, but I'll
Please,
try to
please.
find it later. Yeah. Because I
And
think
also,
now we can actually throw it easily through translation. Because
of
it's much
course.
easier now to do that than I did. I probably downloaded this 10 years ago and just forgot about it. And now it's easy to get, to do a AI translation of the whole video.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, Mark,
Okay,
please,
great.
and reply to my check that DPJ and reply to me,
Yeah,
please.
I will. Yeah, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Okay. See you later.
Ciao.